probably wouldn't surprise you at all to know that Halloween is my favorite holiday, by far. And fall is my favorite season, my favorite time of year by a significant margin. And although the holidays this year are going to be unorthodox for many, that doesn't mean you can't still try to enjoy them. So when I see something like this pop up, it makes me immediately want to try it out and cover it, so here we are. This is Pumpkin Jack, a very cute, spooky Halloween-themed 3D platformer, actually. Not the most common type of game made anymore, but here it is, and it's actually going for a sort of PS2 era style, and in fact it reminds me of the PS1 and PS2 era platformers, the later PS1 era, and really that's kind of a good thing because, like I said, those sorts of things aren't really made so much anymore, and the success of things like the Spyro Reignited trilogy, the Crash trilogy remake, the success of Super Mario Odyssey and A Hat in Time, all these sorts of things show that there is still quite a lot of love for this era, this style of platformer and the way that they were made, and anyone that can still do that is going to have a pretty fun time on their hands because people still really do like to play these games even if they're not all that common anymore, not nearly as much as they used to be. And in theme and in control and general gameplay, this game really reminds me a lot of Medieval 2. And the Medieval games were awesome. I loved those. They were fantastic PS1 era platformers, and this feels kind of like a logical conclusion to that gameplay style. It's very similar. It's got pretty nice platforming. For a long time, 3D platformers were not the greatest because platforming in 3D didn't mix that well when you had the early generation of not having very much camera control and stuff. It made 3D platforming kind of obnoxious. But as the games developed and as camera control and analog sticks and things like that came into the scene, it got a lot better. And we eventually got some like masterpiece level games in the PS2 era, like Psychonauts, for instance. So this game is very much in a lineage that has been enjoyed by a lot of people, even if it is a new take on something that's still pretty classic feeling at its heart. As you can tell, it's got a very nice, colorful, very stylized art style, very reminiscent, honestly, of those PS2 era games, just brought up to date. And it's got just about every sort of mechanic you would expect from a game of this sort, of this lineage. It's got a lot of platforming, it's got some combat, it's got collectibles in the world, an explorable world with multiple paths that eventually converge into a boss fight that's usually sort of a puzzle boss. It's got mini-games and puzzle sections, it's got sort of chase sequences, pretty much anything you can think of that was generally included in that era of 3D platformer, this replicates with style. And it's because of that classic feeling high variety in gameplay that the whole thing is really pretty enjoyable from start to end. It's not that long, but it's a good romp from start to finish. There's not really any downtime. There's not a part of it that feels like a slog or that feels, grindy or anything like that because it doesn't have any RPG mechanics or anything. It is just a classic platformer. So every level has its own theme, its own enemy set, its own mini-games, a bunch of collectibles to find, including a gramophone that you can dance around, and a couple of secrets here and there to see as well. The dialogue is pretty witty, it's actually pretty clever, I like it a lot. You have Jack himself, who you play, who is just very snarky, and you have a crow companion that really just doesn't like anything that's happening and is actually really funny and a nice companion that fits the usual personality that games like this tend to have. It's got a really good Halloween theme and some really good music. I think the music is actually the best part to me, honestly, because it's really nice. It's got a very, of course, as you would expect, a sort of Halloween-y soundtrack, but at the same time, it's also got some sort of Halloween or holiday-like remixes of classical music and stuff like that as well that you'll hear in various minigames and in some of the chase sequences and stuff. So there's actually quite a lot of variety in the music, and it really helps with the atmosphere, ending in the sort of North Pole area, which gets a little bit Christmassy in the music, some bells and things, but still firmly in the Halloween camp so that people like me can still enjoy it. And yeah, there's combat, as I mentioned. The combat is simple as you would expect from a platform of this type. Think medieval, basically. The combat, although a little bit less floaty than that. You have several different weapons that you get usually from beating bosses. You'll get some weapons, and they're actually pretty fun. You start with just a shovel, which is pretty thematic, but you end up getting things like this crazy spear thing that can do charges, a sort of blunderbuss-like weapon, a big scythe that can do spinning attacks, and a couple of spells, including a sort of crow crow-themed blast thing, which is my favorite because I love crows, and it's a really fun thing to use, and this makes the combat feel satisfying. It does its job, just like any platformer of the era that this is calling back to, it feels like it should, and it, with the enemies having a lot of personality and stuff, it adds to the challenge of the area, so you don't just have platforming to get around, although that is still the main focus of the game, as you would hope. The platforming also feels pretty good because you start with a double jump, so you don't have to gain movement abilities or anything like that. In fact, you don't gain movement abilities at all. You start the game with your full repertoire of movement skills, from a jump, double jump, dodge roll, that sort of thing. A bit like a Mario game, I guess you could say, and a lot of other classic platformers of this era, you don't really gain skills in terms of how you traverse the levels. You start with all of them, which is nice. And the levels are nicely varied, each, like I mentioned, having its own theme with its own enemy set themed around what it is. So if you're in a graveyard, expect to fight lots of spirits and like ghostly skeletal things and stuff like that. If you're in a castle, you're going to be fighting some knights, some with shields, some with ranged weapons and things like that. And every area also has things like you're seeing right now in the background, where you just become a head, a pumpkin head, and you have to do some sort of mini game or mini traversal map thing. And these help to add some variety to the gameplay, because these are a bit different from your traditional platforming challenges and are very firmly in the camp of like minigame. And as you saw there, that one was basically whack-a-mole. And there's also your sort of Simon Says things, but with mushrooms and like Halloween-themed classical music, which is awesome. And you've also got stuff like path clearing for these magical orbs. You've got smacking bombs around in certain distances past certain platforms and things, and heightening and lowering platforms to get the bomb to its eventual destination. And even some other stuff like a sort of matching minigame where you match the last names on headstones, like a sort of memory matching game where you turn over cards, only instead you smack headstones and reveal the names and try and match them all to get them to be to get them to blow up, basically. So these are a really cool, appreciated part of the game, because it interrupts the normal combat platforming gameplay with some sort of minigame or other sort of thing for you to do for a little while before you go back to the platforming again, and it helps to theme the levels a little bit better, since each level has its own minigame that is exclusive to that level, and you won't repeat it again somewhere else. It'll be a different one for every other level. It just helps to tie the themes of the levels together a little bit more. And you also have the sort of chase sequence or vehicle section sorts of things, where you, instead of doing the normal platforming thing, you will be in some sort of vehicle or on something like a ghostly horse riding through the sky, where you have to jump over obstacles and smack gates in the way so you don't hit them, to being carried around by a gargoyle, having to keep yourself above the ground so you don't get dragged off of it, to even stuff like riding minecarts around, which is a pretty classic one, and those push cart things, the ones where you have to mash a button to pump them up and down to get them to move along the rails. One of those, but at the same time as having to mash A to keep going, you also have to dodge and weave around to smack these other soldiers that are racing you to a gate to try and keep you from raiding the castle. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of variety in the gameplay here because of all these extra sections, and that's what really makes it feel like it's calling back to those classic games, because they were that as well. They weren't just platforming and just combat. They also had some puzzling. So there's even some physics stuff in this game. So yeah, the overall minigame and puzzle aspects really add to it and make it the full package. It makes it feel like it's supposed to. Another highlight of the game would be the boss fights. The boss fights are also in the sort of classic style of sort of puzzle boss fights. You don't just walk up and smack them. They generally have various mechanics and various attacks that they will cycle through, and you will have to repeat some sort of pattern or something 3 times in order to beat them. And every boss feels vastly different because of this, with each one crowning the theme of its area, from this guy right here, who is a sort of Hell House-style possessed mausoleum encounter that represents one of the 7 deadly sins that you actually have to fight, who summons all these weird skulls in gelatinous, I assume, like ectoplasm cubes, and sweeps along the ground, and stuff you have to jump over, and eventually pulls you into a sort of mini-dimension where you have to lead a skull into the supports of the building to collapse it from the inside, to Witch and her husband on a big sort of sentient tree trunk covered in eyes that has one of those sort of radial boss fights where you have to go around it in a big circle and destroy all of the eyes off of it while avoiding poison on the ground, other enemies, and big roots spawning around the place. to even a more sort of straightforward boss encounter that mostly involves avoiding the patterns of its attacks and then hitting it when it's sort of tired for a minute, and then repeating as it slowly shrinks the stage and makes its attacks harder to avoid. So they all feel like they belong in a game of this sort, in a game of this era. They are sort of half puzzle, half combat, and that's exactly how a boss encounter in a game like this should feel, in my opinion, because that's how they have sort of always been. They are not just combat tests, they are platforming and puzzle tests as well, and it really does a really good job of having these bosses feel like they should, feel like these sort of area-ending, big mechanic crowning encounters with fun themes and really interesting mechanics, and all of them feel very different, none of them feel repeated, none of them feel like you're doing the same thing over and over. They all don't overstay their welcome, because as usual with games like this, you do the thing, whatever the thing is you do, 3 times, and that usually beats the boss, just getting harder, faster, more complicated every time. And so, yeah, they do an excellent job of crowning off the areas and being a really satisfying conclusion to a level, and then give you a cool weapon and you move on to the next level. So, very classic in that respect. It feels exactly like it should, and that's kind of my overall interpretation of the whole game. It feels exactly like it should. It is a really nice Halloween-themed game with excellent music, a very cute art style, a very whimsical theme, some really fun boss fights, some really nice platforming that feels right because of the fine camera control and double jump and all that. You don't feel like you're constantly sliding off of stuff, which can be a problem in 3D platformers. It feels fine. Satisfying combat with a nice variety of weapons, and overall a really great theme. This feels like it could have happily released in the heyday, the PS2 era of games like this, and fit in just fine, but modernized a little bit with a very pretty art style and very nice, precise controls that feel good. Of course, I would recommend that you use a controller for this. That kind of probably goes without saying because it's a 3D platformer, but I figured I'd mention it anyway. Definitely use a controller for this. It is best experienced that way, as you would expect. Pumpkin Jack is just a really good time. It's a pretty fantastic game that sets out to do something pretty simple and does it very admirably well in a way that is enjoyable from start to finish, has enough variety to keep you going and not feel repetitive, and is at a nice price point for its length and everything. It just feels good to play. And it feels good to see things like this again because we don't see a whole lot of these. So yeah, that's Pumpkin Jack. It is a more whimsical, lighthearted take on the Halloween theme, and let's be real here, I think after the year that we've had, we could use some of that. So yeah, the link is as always in the description below this video to the Steam store page. If you would like to check it out yourself, feel free to do so. And thank you guys very much for watching. Have a really nice Halloween, or at least as nice as you can muster during the current conditions, and just do whatever you can to enjoy yourself. Be safe out there, and thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys next time.